I want to talk about today happens to be the anniversary, the 30th anniversary of the Tiananmen Square massacre, and this occurred in Beijing, China. And I'm going to talk about it not just from the perspective of an anniversary, a remembrance, but really what it reveals about what Chinese culture and government was like then. And it's a springboard to tell you about what our show tomorrow, because on our show tomorrow, we have Gordon Chang in studio. And if you don't know who Gordon Chang is, you could Google his name. You'll soon find out. But he is a revered author. He's on every major talk show in this country, all the major networks. He is an expert on China, an expert in North Korea, an expert on Asia. He has lived in various parts of Asia. He has written extensively. He's researched. And his main topics he's been talking about, and what we'll be talking with him tomorrow about, is about the trade deal that President Trump is, well, at the moment not negotiating. They were negotiating. That's kind of broken off. But there was an ongoing trade deal discussion between China and the U.S. And so Gordon Chang will weigh in on that tomorrow, and other aspects about what China is, about what China, what the culture represents. I just want to talk about the Tiananmen Square massacre anniversary and to make 3 or 4 points about it. First of all, if you didn't happen to remember it, it was in 1989, obviously 30 years ago. And there were actually, around the country of China, there were about, I read the number 241, but 240 or so protests happening in cities and towns all over China. And this was a democracy movement. This was a movement in a country where they have a heavily repressive communist government, a movement by young people mainly, but, you know, people of all ages wanting freedom, demanding that they have more representational government, more democracy. They hate living under communism. So this is 30 years ago, and just prior to that, the decade leading up to these protests, there had been a slight softening or lessening of the government's control over the economy. So they had more free market ideas working their way into the mindset of people in China. The idea that, you know, why should the government own everything as it does in communist countries, in communist ideology? Why shouldn't we have more freedom? Why can't we own more things? But it came to a head in this summertime. There's just huge protests in Beijing. One of the most significant images of the Tiananmen Square protests, I think my wonderful producer Matt has it ready, was one man. Just look at this picture. That is one man. He's actually holding shopping bags, standing in front of a lineup of the Chinese Communist military's tanks, lined up in front of the tanks, and they had this. I want to tell you a couple of things. Keep that image up. A couple of things about this image. It became kind of iconic. People around the world knew what that picture was. It came to symbolize the protest that was happening in China, and it was happened on June 4th. And so this became an image which people called the lone man, and a lot of people were asking, what happened to him? You know, what happened to this guy who's standing in front trying to stop the tanks? What did happen in China was they had these protests ongoing, and the government wasn't sure how to handle them. They thought at first maybe they just ignored it and didn't permit it to get much media coverage, that it would just die down. But it didn't. It kept growing and growing and growing. And so this picture you're looking at, this iconic photo from Tiananmen Square, it became known as the lone man picture. And a couple interesting things happened about that. One is people were asking after Tiananmen Square, and because ultimately the government opened fire. They rolled tanks over people, they opened fire, and many people died. People asked, well, how many people died? I will tell you that at the time, people said, well, hundreds and maybe up to 1,000. But one secret British diplomatic cable written at the time from China, 24 hours after the massacre, said that at least 10,000 people were killed. This was a massive, massive square and a massive protest. So at the time, someone aware of it at the time said 10,000 people were killed. So what was happening really was the Chinese young people were saying, you know, we should have a right to more democracy. We want our freedom. We want to push forward. We want more freedom. We want more cutting back on the government's power. We want to fight back against communism, fight back against socialism. Well, what the Chinese government did after this, they have literally, and for this whole time, 30 years, have literally made it impossible for the average Chinese person to find out anything about Tiananmen Square. It's like they're trying to, like in the 1984 book, trying to erase it from the memories of their people. It's never taught in the schools. The Chinese control the internet so much in China that people can't find information about Tiananmen Square even when they go online, because unlike America, where, you know, we're only regulated on the internet by whatever Google does to us, but in China, the government stops you from getting the information they don't want you to have. So a couple interesting things happen. So the people don't know about it. Well, in Taiwan, there is a museum in Taiwan it's just called June 4. Because that's the date of the Tiananmen Square massacre, June 4. So you can, in Taiwan, go and walk through and see the images of this day of massacre in Tiananmen Square in Beijing. I didn't want to put grotesque images up, but I will tell you that you can find images of scores of bodies piled up by the police who've been killed by the military, the Chinese military, that opened fire on the crowds and literally ran tanks over people. You can find pictures of bicycles. I mean, Chinese are still today, and then too, use bicycles to get around their crowded cities. And so bicycles, just scores of bicycles flattened by the Chinese military tanks. Many, of course, grotesque images of people slaughtered by the Chinese military. I'm not going to show you all those, but I want to plant the seed about what it says about the Chinese government and what it says about the communist mindset. They think they get to decide what the people can know. They have decided that the people are not really ever supposed to understand what happened in Tiananmen, and that people have no right to understand what the government did, how they responded, why they responded the way they did. But I'll tell you something interesting. There was a speech given by the Chinese defense minister. I mean, everyone in the world is obviously aware of the 30-year anniversaries today. There have been a lot of programs and you know, different people have written about it and spoken about this 30-year anniversary. So China's defense minister, General Wei, and his last name is Fenghe, so I'm just going to go with Wei Fenghe, but whatever his name is, he told an audience, he spoke in Singapore on Sunday, so 2 days ago, spoke in Singapore 2 days ago, and he talked about the Tiananmen Square and said, in light of the protest and what those people were demanding, which was democracy, remember, representation, they were demanding freedom. This guy said, the current Chinese defense minister, General Wei Fenghe, said in Singapore on Sunday that how the Chinese military responded in slaughtering at least hundreds, if not thousands of people was, in his words, the correct policy. Another term used by the government of China referring to this Tiananmen Square massacre was, it was a vaccination. A vaccination. It was a shot at the people, letting them know you are not going to do this protest. You cannot have what you want. Essentially, he's saying, this vaccination guy who made that statement, he's saying that the country of China, the Communist Party, was protected from the protests of the people by this massacre. There is no remorse expressed by the Chinese government. There is no apology. There is no recognition that maybe we could have handled it differently. What communists cannot stand is people thinking they have the right to live in freedom. Thinking that they can't tolerate that people think they have any rights at all unless the Chinese government The communist government has decided you have those rights. It's the whole concept of communism and how radically different it is from the concepts that founded America. The idea behind communism is the government has complete control. Period. Over everything. You have no rights unless the government decides you have those rights. You don't have rights to express yourself, to assemble, to demand freedom, to demand accountability. You don't even have the right to know what the government did. So this 30-year anniversary of the Tiananmen Square is not being celebrated just as a memory of the lives lost, although that is a reason to acknowledge it. But it's a far deeper thing. It's a profound reminder for today in America to understand when you have radical leftists in this country running, acknowledging they are socialists who are kissing cousins of communists. When you have the same American left that's pushing socialist ideas, that's pushing government control over more and more of society, that is rebuking of individual freedoms, that's intolerant of Christianity, intolerant of Christian beliefs, intolerant of the speech that people, of the free speech that they don't like. This Tiananmen Square anniversary, this reminder is a reminder to America that we are very radically different than communist China, that we are a country founded on rights from God simply because we were born. It's the radical difference between America and socialism, America and communism. America has Judeo-Christian roots. And because we have those roots, it is the ideas in the Bible that the founders of our country spoke about and wrote about and made the argument that we are going to found a country on the idea that each and every individual has rights from God simply because you were born. The government exists to protect those rights. That would be a laughable, in fact, an arrestable statement if made in a communist country, that you think you have any rights at all. And so this Tiananmen Square anniversary, you know, I urge you to read more about it, understand more about it. There are a lot of people trying to write about it. In fact, there are a lot of people talking about whether or not America should have been more, responded in a harsher way toward communist China. At the time, George H.W. Bush was saying, well, you know, we can't get too carried away here. In fact, H.W. Was trying to make the argument at the time that, you know, that we would probably hurt our relationship with China if we protested. We would hurt our relationship with China if we scolded or punished them or called them out or tried to embarrass them. The argument was that China was already on a path of loosening the communist country controls. China was on a good path. If America speaks up, you know, we might cause the Chinese government to revert back to its more controlling ways. Well, obviously, that was a bad call, because all that China has done since then is more repressive, more controlling, more limiting. In fact, I just cannot wait to tell you folks, wait to tell you tomorrow with Gordon Chang here, all of what China really is all about now, what's happening in China. It relates to the trade deal, but also relates to the culture, the government control, the mindset of the communist leadership that is still there today, 30 years after Tiananmen Square.